And we're live. Welcome to In the Dugout. Today, I'm going to be your host. I'm Larry, the Liberty guy, and I'm here with Dr. Andy Bostom. Sten is on a business trip working. Andy, welcome to the show.
Hi, Larry.
How you doing today, Andy?
Good.
Beautiful day out there. So first up, I have 5 questions for you, and
Okay.
so question 1. Let's get to the Rhode Island numbers. Let me pull them up and give me an idea of what you think, and we can go through them a little bit together.
Wow. So it's really burned out. I mean, we're down below 1%. We're in the range of what could be pure false positivity. It's it's a function, as we've been talking about for weeks and weeks now, of the slow accumulation of natural immunity and augmented by vaccine acquired immunity. We're just seeing the cumulative effect of that. And that's even, again, never correcting for this idea of hospitalization or even death with as opposed to from COVID, which is a huge issue. When I analyzed last summer a death certificate analysis report from the state of Florida at the time, and I think at that point it was about 11,000 deaths that they were re-examining. And I went through their report, and they were offering really no independent estimate of what they thought was should not have been counted as COVID deaths, although they were 10% off the top, where it literally wasn't on the death certificate. So you could certainly have included those. I assume they tested positive somewhere along the line. But when I went through all the other analyses that they did, which were really quite remarkable for state legislators, I concluded that up to 45% were not legitimate deaths. And it's interesting, Larry, because we're now seeing that number so this is how schizophrenic the CDC is. At the same time that they're still counting COVID deaths the way they have, since March of 2020, with very radical change from previous death adjudication, particularly for infectious diseases like the flu. That's still in the system. However, they've gone back to the traditional methods, which is a more clinically based approach, and then you confirm with testing if you're suspicious, because after all, a person could present with symptoms that are consistent with a whole range of pneumonias.
Right.
And then you might do a gamut of tests, and then what fits the clinical scenario, the course in the hospital or as an outpatient, is ultimately how you decide whether the person had a pneumonia due to pneumococcus or Legionella or some viral pneumonia, et cetera. And that's been applied to influenza. I mean, we're all, COVID, of course, for whatever the bizarre reasons are, disrupted that whole paradigm. Now, when we look at post-vaccination hospitalizations and death, they're back to the old paradigm.
They went back.
It has to be a clinical syndrome. It has to be a clinical syndrome first and foremost, then confirmed by a positive test.
All of this is just an excuse.
But Larry, it's literally happening at the same time. So why you still have in the system, the numbers? You can go to the sites that track COVID. You'll see no change basically in people who are coming in, the unvaccinated, or what, I don't even know how they distinguish anymore in the total numbers. But then retroactively, they go through the people that they can document have been vaccinated and adjudicate in the old-fashioned way.
And do you think this is all just an excuse to continue the state of emergency?
It's hard to avoid, a different explanation. I mean, but it is. It just shows you how broken the system is and how schizophrenic it is. We could literally have 2 independent processes going on at the same time.
It's disturbing. It shows the inadequacies of government. It's upsetting for all of us that have to dealt with this for the last year and a half. And again, Andy, thank you so much for doing all this. You're bringing truth, and nowhere else are you going to get such a great in-depth answer to a question like that except here on In the Dugout. So my second question to you, as I said, it was a beautiful day out there, sun is shining, and I was out on my bike on my lunch break today, and I happened to go by the local elementary school, and I saw kids playing outside with their masks on.
Oh, I thought that was, well, I thought outside they were supposed to be, they didn't have to wear masks and they should take them off.
Well, that's what I would suggest to them as they're out there. But I mean, with this heat that's going on, does it make sense to have kids in masks at all?
No, and two of the hardest hit states, but also, very, very leftist dominated states, New York and New Jersey, literally the hardest hit states. They saw the heat wave coming. And even Governor Murphy in New Jersey, who's very timid, um, they abandoned the mask mandate for kids in school, period, altogether, over the weekend. And Cuomo, Governor Cuomo in New York had done that as of last Friday. So
So
we are behind the curve,
wait,
even of New York and New Jersey, where paranoia runs high.
now these children are being trained to think and be concerned about this for the rest of their lives.
Yes, it's horrible.
Very, again, upsetting, horrible. Um, Looking back on the whole state of all of this, what do you think we could have done differently? How do you think we should have handled the pandemic? Where, I mean, that's a big question.
You
were the guy running the show, Andy, which the way it should have been.
I would have deferred. I would have deferred to the great previous generation of infectious disease epidemiologists like D.A. Henderson, the man who is probably most responsible for eradicating smallpox, because he was involved in pandemic planning in the 2000s, particularly in the period not long after 2000, where there was anticipation of pandemic influenza and how to plan for that potential catastrophe. And if you look at what was written in that period through about 2010, 2011, all the things that we did were dismissed. In other words, lockdowns were dismissed, mass testing, quarantining the well, masking was deemed to be futile because there were at least, certainly by the end of the first decade, there were enough data out there to show that, at least in randomized trials, it wasn't working, particularly for influenza. So basically, the paradigm was turned on its head. And you have to say that the model that was used, the new model, came directly out of communist China. I mean, remember, those were the first lockdowns, and that's what was recommended to Italy thereafter, and then it became the model for how to behave, with exceptions, like Sweden. And if you look at Sweden's outcomes, clearly Sweden got it right. They are, if anything, in the middle of the pack in the EU. They had a complex situation in Stockholm, which is a huge city. They've had chronic problems, including with flu outbreaks, seasonal flu outbreaks, in their elder care homes. That's where most of the mortality was this time too. But overall, despite being much more open than most other parts of Europe, and certainly in the United States, their mortality per capita is lower than the major countries, certainly the United States, the United Kingdom, et cetera. And they also managed to keep kids in school, in the classroom, up to age 16. And they were not a proponent of masking either. So you see the outcomes now, Larry, and we have the red state, blue state difference in this country. Generally, the red state, blue state difference, but certainly you have the examples like the way Governor DeSantis treated the pandemic versus Governor Cuomo versus our governors. Much more open, much more friendly to the needs of ordinary people to make a living. Florida's basically been open since last fall. And again, their per capita mortality is way lower than New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So to me, the proof is in the pudding.
Proof is in the pudding. And you hit on an amazing point, Andy. And now that we're allowed to talk about the origins of the
Oh
virus,
yeah, that too.
right? So now that it's finally allowed and finally allowed to be questioned, my background is in foreign policy. So that's what I studied in graduate school. And I studied global markets and how countries interact. And it has a lot to do with how Rhode Island, which is what attracted me to the center originally, is how Rhode Island would compete in an increasingly globalized world. One of the issues that I've seen throughout the pandemic and how this has happened is that our institutions were extremely susceptible to Chinese communist propaganda, and Italy was a great gift to them. And you hit on that point, and I think that's one of the reasons why things got so out of hand is that now the pandemic is obviously
Even in a more sinister way, Larry, there's a huge influx of Chinese from the Wuhan area into northern Italy,
right.
and they were allowed to freely travel, whereas there was embargoes traveling within China. So when you see things like that, you begin to say, this is not accidental. This is really rather sinister behavior. On top of now what we know about the origins of the virus, really being some sort of hybrid, perhaps, of a bat virus and a SARS virus that was uh, cultured and isolated in such a way as to enhance its ability to infect human cell lines is the argument. And the so-called idea of this gain of function research coming out of that lab, and whether it got out of that lab originally by design or by accident, it really doesn't matter, because clearly China could have quarantined Wuhan in an old-fashioned way. That's where the outbreak was, and they did for other parts of China, but not for the rest of the world. So the whole thing is concerning. And then when you see the players like Fauci, I think the Judicial Watch FOIA revealed about $850,000 going in collaborative research to that lab. It's hard to deny now that there's some connection, there's some culpability.
Why do you think our public health institutions were so susceptible to this kind of manipulation and overreaction?
I think that they're very comfortable with the Chinese way of doing things. I mean, that just became self-evident.
It seems like the progressive left has been very good at getting their people into places of real power, and that in this pandemic, it's really come out.
Well, you don't have to. I mean, they may be ideological Marxists. I don't know, but the way, from the very beginning, the way Fauci talked about communist China. I mean, it is communist China after all. Right. Communist China with modern day gulags and no real freedom of expression and
human rights violations. The Uyghurs. There's so many examples where these people are not our friends. Their expansion throughout the South China Sea.
Exactly, and a very militaristic, as you said, expansionist program and designs and spoken about in Chinese, certainly, and reported about by serious China scholars like Mike Pillsbury. It's all known. It all ties together. I mean, how you could ignore that even as a public health official and have these cozy relationships with China is beyond me. You have to take a step back. I know as someone that was involved in kidney transplantation research, I was appalled when I learned of the organ transplantation situation in China. And I have to tell you that there was a sister relationship between the department that I worked in and China. And I said, I really, I was encouraged to go on academic visits and things like that. And I said, I just don't want any part of it. It's not, I don't think you should be doing it, but I certainly don't want any part of it. And it was hard for these academics to understand. And,
Right.
and so I can, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're Marxists. It
Right.
just means that they're sort of willfully blind to what goes on.
The bureaucratic, the systems are designed in such a way that it's easy.
And the Chinese offer interesting, in terms of medicine, would offer interesting research collaborations. They have a huge population. There's a degree in some places very sophisticated, in some places other not so sophisticated. But there were tremendous research opportunities, and it also involved a flow of researchers back and forth. And now you can be concerned about things like that, when you see what's going on with stealing technology, with potential for espionage. But none of that seemed to register with these academics. They seem to be willfully blind to all of it.
So that leads into my next question, which is how prepared are we for the next pandemic? Are we just going to have to do this again? Or is this going to be, or do you think the American people are fed up and that we're not going to do this? Red state, blue state, again, it's a complicated question, but this is
Larry,
on my mind.
it's a very, it could cut both ways, because, this turned out to be targeted and benign to a large swath of the population, or not terribly serious to a large swath of the population.
Curious to somebody.
God knows what else could get out of a lab, if things are not changed. So I think the first priority, now that it's clear, this was not a classical zoonosis, coming from a bat, coming from a bird, coming from a pig, that it really looks to have been laboratory derived. That has to be, order of priority number one. That there has to be. I'm. This is sort of beyond what I do as an epidemiologist, but I understand that even the basic conditions in the Wuhan lab were not acceptable for this type of research, even if you were doing it with no nefarious intent.
Right.
That it was basically the isolation procedures that you have in a dentist office. And that's clearly not adequate for highly virulent, deadly, pathogens of any sort, virus, bacteria, whatever.
Yeah, it's one of the big questions, whether this is, was it a deliberate leak, but probably more than likely it was an opportunity that was capitalized on. Then
who knows? I mean, for sure. But the fact that you have Chinese military involved with that lab, I mean, even the darkest possibilities have to be, considered.
Andy, fantastic. Thank you. So last question, and this is going back to Rhode Island, where I studied foreign policy. My alma mater, Salve Regina University. I'm going to share my screen, is forcing students, this one, let's go to this one, to have proof of COVID vaccination in the fall. And now this is an example across,
So Larry, are there medical and religious exemptions allowed?
That's a great question. I imagine that there would probably be, when I was there was a lot of negotiation with the administration. So I don't know how strictly they're going to be actually enforcing the policy, but are these policies called for, especially seeing the low numbers?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, so it's become a sort of boilerplate discussion for me. So the first thing you have to find out is, and that's actually a relatively small number, but how many in the whole, well, it's just the spring semester, in the entire history of testing, which goes back to last summer, how many of these positive tests wound up with a serious illness?
Right.
Okay, that's question number one, and including hospitalization. And were they hospitalized with a pneumonia, or were they hospitalized because they got drunk over the weekend and they tested positive for COVID when they were admitted to the ER?
College. I had
those. So all that information needs to be obtained, and then there has to be the boilerplate religious exemption, and it has to be a religious exemption without imposing. Once you're exempt, are they going to impose a mask on you for the entire semester or year or whatever it is? I mean, so no, there's no, I don't think there's a legal basis for these, although it's a private institution. It's it's still, these are still EUA vaccines. It's a very dicey thing. My recommendation would be to, for students that are concerned, to just to get out of it, to file a religious exemption and see if that'll be accepted. But if the conditions imposed upon them are unacceptable, then they should seek legal counsel. And also any of them that are positive, by any rational stretch, they have a legitimate exemption. They have a medical exemption. They're immune, and
Right.
they're certainly as immune as you're going to get from being vaccinated. And being vaccinated after you've recovered from COVID increases your risk for adverse consequences of the vaccine. So there's a genuine, medical exemption that they should be get on the basis of having tested positive, which could be a sizable fraction of the student population there by now. I mean, we've been through 2 waves.
Right. Andy, fantastic. Thank you so much for appearing today on In the Dugout. Sten's going to be back next week, folks. That's our show. Thanks again. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.